Imagine, for a second, holding a highly classified, step-by-step blueprint.
Okay.
I mean, we are talking about an operational manual for eradicating world poverty, completely dismantling systemic corruption, and building, an unbreakable geopolitical state.
Right.
It is right there in your hands.
Right.
And instead of opening it or, actually reading the schematics or poring over the instructions, you just sort of rub the cover on your forehead for good luck before a job interview.
Yeah.
Or maybe you just memorize a few lines from page 3
Yeah.
and recite them when you lose your car keys. I mean, that sounds like a bad joke, doesn't it?
It really does.
But that is exactly what humanity has done with one of the most widely read, heavily scrutinized texts in the history of the world.
It really is the ultimate historical irony. I mean, we have taken something that was explicitly designed to be a functional, radical mechanism for sweeping societal change, and we've essentially domesticated it.
Domesticated it, yeah.
Right? Like we shrank it down into this comfortable, quiet ritual that asks absolutely nothing of our politics, nothing of our socioeconomic structures, and certainly nothing of our wallets.
The ritual trap.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we are breaking out of today. Because today's deep dive is absolutely not about religious rituals or personal piety or mysticism.
No, not at all.
We are unpacking a massive, incredibly dense, and honestly revolutionary lecture by the scholar Allama G. Parwez.
Yeah.
Specifically, we are looking at his extensive notes and analysis of Surah Al-Imran, verses 27 and 28.
Yes.
We are taking a text that has been treated for centuries as a mere religious placeholder, and we are looking at the source material's claim that it is actually a highly advanced, fiercely rational civilizational blueprint for an ideological state.
And the sources we have are extensive. We have translated excerpts, comprehensive historical notes, and a framework that completely redefines everything from the basic concept of citizenship to the hard realities of national security.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I am looking at these sources, and they claim that the first massive roadblock to understanding this blueprint is the language itself.
Right.
The argument is that traditional translations haven't just tweaked the meaning of the words, they have entirely masked a massive sociopolitical paradigm.
That is the foundational argument of Parwez's lecture, yes. Because think about it. If you are going to build a society using a blueprint, you first have to understand the exact engineering terminology the architect used.
Obviously.
And the text argues that over centuries, the terminology of the Quran was slowly diluted from active state-building vocabulary into passive spiritual vocabulary.
So like words losing their original teeth.
Exactly. To grasp this, we have to start with a fundamental linguistic paradigm shift. The lecture draws a razor-sharp, uncompromising line between two specific concepts.
Okay.
The first is mazhab, which is the traditional Arabic and Persian word used for religion. And the second is deen, which is the word the Quranic text actually uses for itself.
I feel like a lot of people use those interchangeably, though. What is the practical, I guess, boots-on-the-ground difference between a religion and what this text calls deen?
Well, think about how religion, or mazhab, operates in the modern framework. It is fundamentally individualized.
Right, it's personal.
Exactly. It is a private matter of the heart, characterized by rituals, prayers, and personal belief systems. But crucially, the lecture points out that religion almost always binds people together based on accidental traits.
Accidental traits, like what?
Well, for the vast majority of human history, your religion has been an incident of your birth. You are born into a certain family in a specific geographic location with a specific biological lineage, and that dictates your religion. It is an inherited identity.
Hold on, I stop you there. I think a lot of listeners would push back on that. I mean, people choose their religions all the time today.
Sure, they do.
People convert. They have spiritual awakenings. It's not purely just an accident of birth anymore, is it?
Yeah. While individual conversions happen, the source material is analyzing the structural, societal level of how these groups form and maintain power across generations.
Oh, I see. The macro level.
Right. Historically and statistically, the overarching structure of religious communities relies on biological continuity. The lecture argues that the Quran systematically and, well, violently dismantles this biological basis for human unity.
Wow.
It argues that organizing a society based on accidental traits where you happen to be born is an irrational way to build a civilization.
So if it rejects mazhab, what is deen?
Deen, according to this framework, translates much more accurately to a system of life or a comprehensive sociopolitical ideology.
An ideology, okay.
Yeah, it is an active, chosen constitution. Deen constructs what the text calls a markaz imilat, which translates to a central community or a centralized administrative authority.
Like a government.
Exactly like a government, but the central community is based strictly and exclusively on a shared ideological framework. You absolutely cannot inherit it. You aren't born into it because your parents were part of it.
So how do you join?
You opt into it by consciously accepting its constitutional principles.
I see. So it's the difference between inheriting your grandfather's vintage watch, it's just yours because of who your parents are, versus signing a legally binding social contract to gain citizenship in a newly formed republic.
That is a perfect analogy.
You actually have to read the terms and conditions, agree to them, and sign your name. It requires active intellectual consent, not just a blood test.
What's fascinating here is how that requirement for active consent cascades into every other definition in the text, and that brings us to two of the most deeply misunderstood and frankly weaponized terms in the entire Quranic lexicon.
Oh, let me guess. Mu'min and kafir.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Because traditionally you hear those translated directly as believer and infidel.
Right.
And in modern context, kafir is thrown around almost entirely as a derogatory label. It's a theological insult. It's the ultimate abusive sorting hat. It basically just means, you are the bad guy and God hates you.
Precisely. But Parwez's rational analysis completely strips away that mystical, judgmental baggage and redefines these terms within a strict, systemic, organizational framework.
So taking the theology out of it.
Exactly. If deen is a constitutional system of life, then a mu'min is simply an individual who consciously accepts the laws of that divine society.
Like signing the contract.
Right. They are the ones who read the social contract and sign it. They become an official member of the ideological state.
So it's a legal civic designation. It basically just means citizen of the ideological constitution.
Yes. And a kafir, therefore, is logically just a non-member. It is someone who looks at that specific set of societal laws and says, no, I do not accept these.
But wait. The word has to mean more than just non-citizen.
Yeah.
Right. Because the way it's treated in the texts suggests active conflict, not just someone politely declining an invitation to join a club.
This is where we have to look at the linguistic root of the Arabic word, which the lecture heavily emphasizes. The root of kufr literally means to hide, to cover, or to suppress. The text explains that this term doesn't just refer to someone who passively disbelieves a theology.
It's an active thing.
Yes. It refers to those who actively attempt to suppress the emergence of permanent divine values, things like absolute universal justice or equitable economic distribution.
Why would someone want to suppress economic equity?
Oh.
Because it costs them money.
Exactly. The lecture argues that kufr is driven by vested interests. If a society is built on exploiting the weak, consolidating wealth into the hands of a few elites, and using religious superstitions to keep the masses quiet, then a new system that demands absolute economic equity and rational justice is an existential threat to those elites.
It ruins their whole setup.
Right. Those who suppress this equitable system to protect their own monopolies and personal interests are engaging in kufr.
That is a massive paradigm shift. So it's not a debate about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
No, not at all.
It's not someone saying, I don't believe in your invisible theology. It's someone saying, if your system of equitable wealth distribution actually takes hold in this region, my monopoly on resources is completely ruined.
Exactly.
Therefore, I will use my power to suppress and destroy your system. It's defining an ideological opponent who has a vested material interest in maintaining an unjust status quo.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this linguistic key completely changes the entire reading of the text. Because if mu'min and kafir are actually political, civic, and ideological designations of members versus non-members who want to suppress the system, then all the subsequent Quranic directives on how to interact with them aren't about religious bigotry or spiritual elitism.
What are they about then?
They are entirely about state security, administrative integrity, and ideological survival.
That perfectly sets up another term from the lecture notes that almost always gets the ritual treatment.
Uswa Hasana.
Usually when I hear that phrase, it is translated as the good example, and it specifically refers to the prophet. And practically speaking, I've seen that interpreted as imitating their personal aesthetics.
Right.
Like how they dress, the style of their beard, which foot they use to step into a room, their daily personal habits.
Which is the ultimate domestication of the text. I mean, we reduce a sweeping civilizational model down to personal grooming habits.
Yeah.
Parwez argues that the literal functional translation of Iswa is model or blueprint. The analogy used in the source text is brilliant. It's like a precise physical model that a master architect or a drawing master places on a desk for their students to replicate structurally.
Okay.
It does not refer to the master's personal wardrobe. It refers to the eternal structural guidelines for establishing a society. And interestingly, the lecture points directly to Prophet Abraham as the ultimate structural blueprint for this kind of ideological statecraft.
Abraham. Okay, so if his life is the master blueprint, what does that structural drawing actually look like? Because the way the sources paint the picture of Abraham, he isn't just a wise old man in a tent.
No.
He is essentially the ultimate ideological disruptor.
He really is. To understand the blueprint, you have to look at Abraham's backstory as it is presented and analyzed in these sources. He wasn't born a marginalized outsider. He was born directly into the household of the era's supreme chief priest in the kingdom of Nimrod.
Wow.
In that historical context, being the chief priest wasn't just a ceremonial religious role. It was a position of immense, staggering political power and unimaginable wealth. The text notes that the king, Nimrod himself, sought the chief priest's counsel on matters of state.
So Abraham isn't starting in the bottom. He is the heir apparent to the ultimate seat of power in his civilization.
Exactly.
He is set up to inherit this entire lucrative, socially dominant system. All he has to do is play along.
But Abraham looks at the mechanics of this system. He sees a society based on the irrational worship of handcrafted idols. And the lecture stresses that this idol worship wasn't just a harmless cultural quirk. It was an active tool for social control.
Like a way to keep the masses in line.
Right. It was a mechanism designed to consolidate wealth among the priestly class and the elites while keeping the masses subjugated through superstitious fear. Abraham recognizes that this system fundamentally violates human dignity and rational truth. So he rejects it. He openly confronts his father, the chief priest.
Which is the equivalent of this CEO's son standing up at the shareholder meeting and declaring the entire business model to be a criminal enterprise.
Yes.
I mean, it's institutional suicide.
It is. And when his father inevitably threatens him with expulsion and violence, Abraham doesn't back down or try to negotiate a compromise. He willingly accepts being stripped of his vast inheritance, his home, his family, and his societal status, rather than compromise on the ideological truth.
He practically demonstrated that adherence to a permanent universal value has to supersede even the closest biological associations. He actively severs the biological tie for the ideological one.
Exactly.
But I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of anyone listening. Isn't human nature fundamentally wired to protect family above all else?
It is a strong instinct, yes.
I mean, evolutionary biology tells us that blood is thicker than water. That is an incredibly radical, almost abrasive concept to introduce as your foundational blueprint, that your ideological truth has to trump your loyalty to your own father.
It is entirely radical, and you are right to point out that friction. But the source text doesn't shy away from that friction at all. It leans into it. The lecture explicitly notes that in this specific Quranic framework, biological ties, whether it is the story of Noah and his son or Abraham and his father, are legally, socially, and emotionally severed the moment their core ideologies fundamentally diverge.
So the text is saying that biology is actually a flimsy foundation for a society.
Exactly. It argues that an incident of birth, your shared DNA, simply cannot form the foundation of a purposeful, resilient nation. If a nation is just a group of people who happen to be born on the same side of a river, they have no shared trajectory.
They just share an address.
Right. Only a shared commitment to universal, permanent, divine principles can forge a true society. Abraham, shattering his traditional metrics of identity, breaking the idols of bloodline, tribe, and geography, is the very core of the blueprint.
And that completely changes the definition of another major historical concept, which is migration.
Yes.
Because when Abraham breaks these chains, the text quotes him saying, "I am going to my Lord."
Oh.
Now, the traditional literal reading of that is that he packed his bags and walked to a physical geographic location where God resided.
Which, as the lecture points out, logically collapses on itself within the text's own theological framework, since it defines the divine as omnipresent.
Right.
You cannot physically migrate to a God that is everywhere. Therefore, Parwez argues that this migration was not geographical, it was an entirely systemic shift.
A systemic shift. What does that mean in practice?
It means he was migrating away from a system of exploitation and irrationality in order to establish a new socio-political environment, a new jurisdiction where divine laws and equitable permanent values could be practically enacted on the ground.
Wow. Okay.
And because he did this, because he completely severed his geographical and biological chains and stood absolutely alone on these permanent values, the text says he proved a profound point. A single individual standing firmly on ideological truth constitutes a complete nation, an ummah, unto himself.
The one-man nation. That is an incredibly empowering concept. But if you really think about it, it's also a deeply isolating one.
It can be.
It means your true community, your true family, isn't the people you share a genetic code with, it's the people who share your constitutional ideology.
Yes, and that brings us directly to the operational reality, the hard mechanics of this blueprint. If a society is built purely on an ideological choice, rather than geography or biology, how does that society actually govern itself? More importantly, how does it protect its administrative core from those who fundamentally oppose its ideology?
Right. Because if your nation isn't defined by a physical wall or a mountain range, but by an idea, your greatest threat isn't necessarily an invading army from across a border.
No, it's not.
Your greatest threat is subversion from within. Someone adopting the aesthetics of your system while sabotaging its mechanics.
Exactly.
And this brings us to a critical segment of the outline, detailing two specific Arabic terms, Bitana and Awliya. Let's decode these, because this is where the theory hits national security.
Traditionally, if you read standard translations, Bitana and Awliya are translated very loosely, usually as friends, companions, or allies.
Those casual terms.
Right. And the verses simply sound like they're telling people not to be friends with those of other religions. But systemically, Parwez analyzes Bitana through its literal, tangible root. The word literally means the inner lining of a garment.
The inner lining. So the layer of fabric that is closest to the body, it's hidden from the outside, but it touches the skin.
Exactly. Metaphorically, in a statecraft context, it symbolizes the inner circle. It represents the trusted confidants, the policymakers, the custodians of state secrets, the core administrative steering wheel of the society.
Okay, and Aliyah?
Awliya, similarly, signifies political guardians or high-level ideological allies. Surah Al-Imran explicitly, unconditionally forbids the believers, the members of this ideological state, from taking ideological opponents, the non-members, as their batana.
I understand the metaphor, but why is the rule so absolute? I mean, if someone is a non-member, but they are peaceful and highly skilled, why lock them out of the inner lining?
Because, as the lecture argues, human beings are driven by their underlying values. Opponents of the system, those who reject a constitutional mandate of universal equity, inherently prioritize their own personal, nationalistic, or capitalistic vested interests over the universal welfare that the divine system is trying to establish.
They have different goals.
Exactly. There is a permanent, irreconcilable ideological clash at the core of their worldviews. Giving individuals who fundamentally oppose your constitution sensitive roles in policy-making, strategy, or defense risks the total subversion of the state.
Because they'll just steer it the other way.
Right. It's not about them being evil people. It's about the fact that they will naturally seek the system's downfall, or at least its dilution, because it conflicts with their own core interests.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I am reading this and realizing this isn't just ancient abstract theory. You can draw a direct, unbroken line from this ancient text to modern secular statecraft.
You really can.
It's exactly the same logical process used for obtaining top-level national security clearances today. If you are the United States government, you are absolutely not going to give a known active foreign intelligence agent the nuclear launch codes.
No.
You aren't going to make them the director of the CIA. And it wouldn't matter if that foreign agent was the most brilliant mathematician, the most charismatic leader, or the most efficient administrator on the planet.
Right.
Their fundamental loyalty is anchored to a competing system. You wouldn't call the U.S. government bigoted or intolerant against foreign spies. You'd call it basic, rational, administrative survival. You cannot hand the keys of the engine to someone who doesn't believe in the destination.
That is a perfect modern parallel. And the lecture provides a profound historical anecdote to illustrate this exact structural protocol being tested in reality.
Oh, the Caliph Umar story.
Yes. During the era of the early Islamic Empire, the Caliph Umar, who was known for his vast administrative expansions, was approached by one of his governors. The governor wanted to appoint a highly skilled non-Muslim to a very sensitive, high-level state accounting and administrative position.
Okay.
The governor's argument was purely pragmatic. This man was supposedly the absolute best at the job, a logistical genius, and the state needed his specific skills.
Right, administrative convenience. I mean, any modern CEO would just say, hey, hire the guy, he's great at math, we need the spreadsheets balanced.
But Caliph Umar explicitly and categorically refused to approve the appointment. He specifically cited these exact Quranic injunctions regarding batana. He recognized that prioritizing administrative convenience or superficial operational skill over constitutional loyalty at the core of the state machinery would fatally violate the ideological security of the system.
So no shortcuts.
No. The inner lining of the state, the repository of its strategies and vulnerabilities, had to remain ideologically secure no matter how tempting a shortcut might be.
Now, I want to tread carefully here because the sources we are looking at frame this ancient ideological divide, this absolute separation of members and non-members into two distinct political entities as having major, massive implications for modern history.
Yes, they do.
And for you, the listener, we need to be crystal clear on our role here. Our job on this deep dive is not to take a political stance. We are not endorsing any historical movements. Our mission is just to objectively report how this specific source material connects these ancient structural texts to modern geopolitical events.
Understood. It is vital to present the lecture's claims objectively. The lecture explicitly discusses this concept of ideological division as the foundational bedrock of what is known historically as the two-nation theory.
Okay.
The sources cite the philosopher and poet Allama Iqbal, who was a fierce critic of modern geographic nationalism. Iqbal argued that defining a nation merely by the borders of a piece of land or by shared ethnicity was a false idol. He famously called territorial nationalism a shroud of religion.
A shroud of religion.
Yes. In his view, derived from this Quranic blueprint, true, enduring unity could only ever be ideological.
And the text directly connects this philosophy to Quaid-i-Azam Jinnah and the political movements that ultimately led to the creation of Pakistan. The core argument presented in Parwez's lecture is that forcing biologically or geographically bound people into a single, unified political entity when their core ideologies, values, and visions for justice fundamentally clash is structurally unworkable. Right. It's like trying to build a house where half the architects are using blueprints for a skyscraper and the other half are using blueprints for a submarine.
That is exactly the premise. The source material frames various historical conflicts, mentioning everything from the complex Hindu-Muslim political dynamics in the 20th century subcontinent all the way back to the Crusades, not as simple ethnic squabbles or petty tribalism, but as the inevitable explosive friction that occurs when fundamentally opposed ideological systems are forced to share the same administrative space without a shared constitution.
So it's an inevitable conflict.
According to the text, yes. The lecture posits the creation of Pakistan as a modern attempt to realize this ancient Quranic mandate, which is to establish a sovereign space based purely on ideological alignment rather than geographic or biological accidents.
Okay, so let's pause and look at the immense picture we've painted so far from this text. We have a society that demands absolute, unwavering ideological purity at the very top of its leadership.
Yes.
It demands that you sever biological ties if your family opposes the system. It forms a one-man nation based on permanent values, and it absolutely legally locks out anyone who disagrees with its constitution from the inner circle of state power, the batana.
Yes. That is the administrative core.
I'm going to be honest with you, to a modern listener, especially one raised in Western democratic traditions, this raises a massive flashing red flag.
I can see why.
If ideological opponents are permanently locked out of the inner circle of power, does that mean they were just oppressed second-class citizens living under a theocratic dictatorship? Because locking people out of power based on their ideology sounds exactly like a recipe for tyranny. It sounds like the very exploitation this system claims to be fighting.
It is a completely valid concern, and it is the first question any rational person should ask. But this is where the source text violently rejects that assumption.
Okay.
To understand why it isn't a tyranny, we have to look at the other half of the blueprint. The state has an unyielding ideological boundary at its administrative core, yes, but it is simultaneously bound by strict, non-negotiable, mathematically precise operational protocols regarding how it treats every single human being within its physical borders.
Every single one.
Yes, and the absolute first of those protocols is universal justice, defined in the text as adl and quist.
Universal. meaning not just justice for the members of the ideological club.
Exactly. The lecture emphasizes that the state must dispense absolute, unwavering justice to all residents, explicitly and specifically including its ideological opponents.
Even the ones they locked out of the inner circle.
Yes. The Quran dictates that acting with absolute justice is the closest possible manifestation of taqwa. Now, taqwa is usually translated as fear of God, but systemically it means actively aligning your life and your society with divine laws.
Right.
The text explicitly states that hostility or even deep-seated historical enmity towards any group of people must never prevent the believers from dealing with them equitably in legal, economic, and social matters.
So, to use our earlier analogy, you might not give them the nuclear launch codes, but if that non-member goes to court against the caliph himself over a property dispute, the judge must be entirely blind to their ideology. The law must protect them unconditionally.
Precisely. The legal system cannot be weaponized,
Yeah.
but it goes much, much further than just having a fair court system. This brings us to the beating heart of this civilizational blueprint, the economic engine, which the text calls Nizam-i-Rububiyat, or the system of providence.
Rubiyat, let's break that down in detail because the sources place a massive overarching emphasis on this. It seems like the entire system hinges on this one concept.
It does. In this ideological framework, the state is not just a passive referee that occasionally enforces laws and collects taxes. The state is defined as the operational physical machinery for divine providence on earth.
What does divine providence mean in a practical economic sense?
It means that the absolute highest priority of the state, its foundational reason for existing, is to guarantee the provision of sustenance or risk and fundamental human rights to every single citizen within its borders. It means designing an economy where wealth cannot consolidate into the hands of a few. It means no one goes hungry. No one is left without shelter, medical care, or basic needs. The state is the mechanism that ensures the Earth's resources are distributed equitably to all who need them, much like the sun provides light to everyone indiscriminately.
And here's the kicker that directly answers my earlier concern about tyranny. This universal economic guarantee applies to the non-members too, the ideological opponents.
Crucially, yes, without exception, non-Muslim minorities residing under the jurisdiction and protection of this ideological state, who are referred to historically in the text as Jemi, must receive the exact same economic security, the exact same standard of living, and the exact same human rights as the Muslims.
Wow.
There can be zero discrimination in the distribution of basic human necessities. You cannot starve out your ideological opponents.
That is incredible.
Furthermore, the ideological state is strictly, legally mandated to provide administrative and physical protection for the places of worship belonging to those non-Muslim minorities. The believers, the members of the state, who hold the military and administrative power, are explicitly commanded by their own constitution to protect the temples, churches, and synagogues within their borders with their own lives if necessary.
Okay, I have to stop and marvel at this dichotomy. I really do. It's an incredible tightrope walk of statecraft.
It is.
On the one hand, the state is utterly ruthless and uncompromising in its ideological security at the top, zealously protecting the batana, ensuring no opponent touches the steering wheel. But on the exact same hand, it is radically, unconditionally egalitarian in its economic distribution at the bottom.
Right.
How do you reconcile those two things logically? I mean, how does the inner circle not just say, well, we have the power, let's keep the wealth for ourselves?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of Parwez's framework, it actually makes perfect, elegant, logical sense. The mechanism that prevents corruption is the strict division between what belongs to the realm of human rights and what belongs to the realm of state administration.
Explain that division.
Universal human rights. The right to food, the right to shelter, the right to impartial justice, the right to freedom of worship are guaranteed to all residents simply by virtue of them being human beings. Their biology and humanity entitle them to rububiyat.
Right.
But state administration, the steering wheel of the ideological system, is not a human right. It is a matter of constitutional alignment. You do not have a human right to be the head of national intelligence. You do have an absolute human right to eat.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. Human rights are universal, but administrative access is constitutional.
Exactly.
And the text also talks about how members of this society are supposed to interact with these ideological opponents on a daily interpersonal basis. It introduces the concept of hosn suluk.
Yes, which translates to broad-minded coexistence or excellent social conduct. The strict prohibition on making ideological opponents your inner circle confidants in matters of state does not in any way mean you treat them poorly or suspiciously in daily life.
So no paranoia.
Right. The text mandates a culture of large-heartedness, open-mindedness, and impeccable social conduct toward non-believers who are not actively waging physical war against the state. Personal empathy, decency, fair trade, and kindness in everyday social interactions remain fully intact and are actually demanded right alongside those strict national security boundaries.
So practically speaking, you can be great neighbors, you can share meals, you can engage in commerce, you can help them fix their roof, you can build a flourishing community together. You just don't hand them the keys to the ideological engine room of the central government.
Exactly. It completely separates personal animosity from structural security. You do not have to hate someone to recognize that their political ideology makes them unsuitable for your state's inner administration.
Okay, so we have this blueprint. It's incredibly detailed. It demands ideological unity, strict administrative security, universal blind justice, and a guaranteed economic engine of providence that feeds everyone. But here is the massive hole in the theory. What actually enforces this?
What do you mean by enforces?
I mean, humans are fundamentally corruptible. States fail all the time. The most beautiful constitutions on earth have been shredded by greedy politicians. If the people in the Batana decide to abandon Rubaiyat and start hoarding wealth, what happens? Does God just throw lightning bolts from the sky to destroy their economy? How does this ancient text explain the actual rise and fall of these societies in the real world?
That is a crucial question, and it is where the text introduces what we could vividly call the social physics of the Quran. It defines a scientific, inescapable inevitability to social conduct through what it calls the law of makafat, or the law of retribution and requital.
Retribution usually sounds highly theological. It sounds like divine anger, a punishment from the sky because you didn't pray hard enough.
Right. But Parwez analyzes makafat not as arbitrary divine anger, but as an inescapable structural law of action and result. It functions exactly like a law of physics. Think of a poorly engineered bridge.
Okay, let's use the bridge analogy.
If engineers build a massive suspension bridge, but they use cheap steel, ignore weight distribution algorithms, and pocket the extra money, the bridge is eventually going to collapse under the weight of traffic.
Heavily.
When that bridge collapses, it isn't because gravity was angry with the engineers. It isn't a mystical punishment. The bridge collapsed because the builders fundamentally violated the mathematical and physical laws of structural integrity.
So cause and effect.
Exactly. Parwez argues that makafat applies this exact same scientific principle to civilizational behavior. A society's survival, its rise to power, or its descent into humiliating collapse is not based on luck.
Right.
And it is certainly not based on them being God's chosen favorites who can do no wrong. It is strictly scientifically bound to its alignment with natural laws, and most importantly, the establishment of that economic justice we just talked about.
So the economy is the key.
Yes. The economic engine of Rubaiyat is the load-bearing wall of a society. If that fails, if wealth consolidates into the hands of the elites, if the masses starve, if the justice system becomes a tool for the rich, the structural integrity of the society is compromised, it will inevitably collapse under the law of makafat. It is just a matter of time.
But wait, we see unjust, highly exploitative societies thrive and wield immense power in the world all the time. How does the text account for that?
The source material addresses this by taking a long-term civilizational perspective versus a short-term material one. A society might hoard wealth and achieve a temporary spike in military or material power through exploitation, but that very exploitation breeds internal rot.
Like termite damage.
Right. It creates massive wealth gaps, internal rebellion, intellectual stagnation, and structural fragility. The law of makafat dictates that an unjust system cannot sustain itself indefinitely. The friction of inequity will eventually tear it apart from the inside or leave it too weak to defend itself from the outside.
It's cause and effect on a civilizational, generational scale. And this ties directly into another deeply misunderstood term the text highlights, which is izat.
Ah, yes.
Usually, if you watch a movie or read a historical novel, izat is translated simply as personal honor or respect. Like, you insulted my family's honor.
But in the systemic Quranic lexicon, as explained in these notes, izat means something much more tangible. It means dominance, power, independence, and fortification.
Geopolitical leverage.
Exactly. Real, unshakable power on the world stage. And the lecture issues a stark, uncompromising warning regarding this. It says that believers, members of an ideological state that has grown weak, often fall into the delusion of begging for alliances, friendships, or protective treaties with their ideological opponents.
Hoping to get some of that power.
Right. They think that subservience, or playing the geopolitical game of compromise, will grant them that it will give them security or a seat at the table.
Like trying to align with a superpower, hoping they'll throw you a bone.
Precisely. The text argues that this is structurally impossible. True is that true power only ever comes from self-reliance and strict internal adherence to the divine system of economic justice and ideological unity.
So no handouts.
No. You simply cannot beg for dominance or security from people whose vested interests fundamentally require your system to fail.
So what does this all mean for how the state conducts itself? It means a society cannot lie, cheat, compromise, or beg its way to the top. Which brings us to a fascinating and incredibly challenging diplomatic principle discussed in the text, the complete and utter rejection of taqiyya.
Taqiyya, traditionally, in certain sectarian historical interpretations, is the practice of hiding one's faith, or forming deceptive friendships and alliances out of fear in order to protect oneself from powerful opponents.
Basically, it's diplomatic hypocrisy.
Right.
Smiling at your enemy, pretending to agree with their system, and hiding your true constitutional ideology because you know you were outgunned and you were scared.
Yes. And the source text we are analyzing vehemently, unconditionally rejects this interpretation. Parwez argues that an ideological state must operate on open truth, bravery, and absolute transparency.
No hiding.
Right. Pretending to align with opponents out of cowardice completely contradicts the very foundation of establishing a divine society based on permanent truth.
The text is so strict about this that it mentions international treaties must be formal, clear, and strictly honored. You cannot use deception.
Absolutely not.
And if a treaty is broken by the other side, or if circumstances change so drastically that you have to break it, you cannot just launch a surprise attack under the cover of darkness. You have to formally, publicly notify the opposing party to ensure both sides are on equal footing before the agreement is officially terminated.
Because an ideological system that claims to be the physical machinery for universal truth and divine providence cannot, by definition, rely on deception, backstabbing, or cowardice.
It defeats the purpose.
Exactly. Hypocrisy has absolutely no place in the blueprint. If you have to lie to survive, your system is already structurally dead.
It's incredibly demanding. When you lay it all out like this, it is staggering. It demands you walk away from your own biological inheritance if it's corrupt.
Yes.
It demands you lock out brilliant, capable people from your administrative government if they don't share your exact constitutional ideology. It demands you tirelessly feed, shelter, and protect those very same ideological opponents unconditionally.
Right.
And it demands you face your geopolitical enemies with absolute transparency without ever hiding behind the shield of deceptive diplomacy.
It is the ultimate systemic challenge. It is not a religion of comfort. It is a crucible for building a civilization.
So let's synthesize all of this. We started this deep dive by looking at how millions of people treat these verses as a ritual trap, reciting them for blessings, treating them like a magic talisman.
Yeah.
But what we've uncovered from Allama Parwez's lecture is a completely different universe of thought. We found a permanent civilizational value. The core takeaway from these sources is that, true, enduring human unity must be ideological. It cannot be based on biology or geography. We learned that a society's actual survival, its geopolitical power, depends entirely on ruthlessly protecting its ideological core from subversion, while simultaneously and without a single exception, guaranteeing universal economic sustenance, rubaiyat, and absolute justice, adl, for every single human being within its borders, regardless of what they believe.
That is the true, rational, structural blueprint hidden within Surah Al-Imran.
But there is a loose end. As we wrap up, there is a little breadcrumb left in the source notes that we absolutely need to point out because it completely changes the dynamic of what we just discussed.
Yes, there is. This raises an important question. We just established that the lecture vehemently rejects Taqiyya, the idea of using deceptive diplomacy, pretending to be an ally, or hiding your true ideology out of fear. It explicitly states that an ideological state must be open, brave, and transparent at all times.
Right. No deception, no cowardice.
However, the notes also clearly mention that the Quranic text in these verses does contain an explicit exception clause regarding fear.
So an exception clause.
Yes. The lecture hints that there is a scenario where standard diplomatic protocols shift. Parwez insists that the true, rational application of this exception clause will be covered in a subsequent session, But he makes it very clear that it fundamentally cannot mean ideological compromise or cowardly deception.
So I want to pose this directly to you, the listener, to mull over as we end this deep dive. Think about the mechanics we just built. If true security and geopolitical power come purely from establishing this incredibly just, transparent economic engine, and if we are strictly morally forbidden from practicing deceptive diplomacy out of fear,
Right.
what on earth is the actual rational application of that fear exception clause? How does an ideological state handle an overwhelming existential threat, an enemy that is marching to wipe you off the map without compromising its core truth?
Hey, it's a tough one.
How do you survive when the wolves are literally breaking down the door if you aren't allowed to wear sheep's clothing?
It is a profound strategic cliffhanger for the next piece of the blueprint.
It really is. We started today looking for a broken bone on an X-ray, expecting to find a simple binary religious ritual. Instead, we found the breathtakingly complex, fiercely demanding architecture of an entire civilization. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the true blueprint of an ideological engine.